Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this special edition of Al Jazeera, in which we are showing the impact of UAE-Israel Deal on Masjid Al Aqsa, what it means for Masjid Al Aqsa and in particular Al-Haram al-Sharif. With me to discuss the issue, I have a special guest from Jerusalem, Daniel Siderman, and I will introduce him later on. What I want to do first is to explain to our viewers who may not be familiar with the region what we mean by Masjid Al Aqsa and Al-Haram al-Sharif. This deal that was signed on 13th of August between Trump, Netanyahu, and Mohammed bin Zayed has been trumpeted, shall we say, as an Abrahamic deal, as a peace deal of the century, as a negotiation between two countries as if they were in warring factions, and now they've created a peace deal. But despite that, what does it mean for Masjid Al-Aqsa and the impact it has on the long-term freedom for the Palestinian people and the future of Masjid Al-Aqsa itself? So before I proceed, I would like to show you the first image of Masjid Al-Aqsa, and so that we know and understand what we are discussing. The Al-Haram al-Sharif is the area that is covered in the red line. As far as Muslims are concerned, every piece of territory within that red line, which is approximately 35 acres, is Al-Haram al-Sharif, or also referred to as the Temple Mount by the Israelis. Within that red lines, we have got approximately four minarets, 14 gates, 25 water wells, and approximately 42 monuments. So this is a big area, and as far as Muslims are concerned, because they believe this is the site of Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj, where the Prophet was taken on the night of Ascension, and he performed Salah there in front of all the prophets that had come before him, of approximately 124,000 prophets. Every centimeter of that land is blessed and it's not negotiable. Of course, for the Israelis, and this is where the complication takes place, because for the Israelis, the language they use for this area is different. I'll show you a second map of the place itself so that you understand that within this haram is the Black Dome Mosque on the left-hand side. For the Israelis, they call this Al-Aqsa Mosque, and they make a differentiation with the Al-Haram al-Sharif and Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now this, in negotiations and in peace treaties, is extremely important as a legal document, because when you sign a legal document, you have to know three things. One, the terms that are used and what they mean. Second, what has been left out from the agreement, because that becomes something that could be misinterpreted by both sides. And thirdly, and much more important for us today, is what has been considered to carry two meanings for the two different parties. And to try and understand this, I have, as I mentioned to you, I've got a special guest from Jerusalem by the name of Daniel Siderman. He's a lawyer and founder of Terrestrial Jerusalem, and he has been central in trying to monitor the activities of the Israelis in Jerusalem over the at least 2 decades that I am aware of. So Daniel, welcome to the show, and it's glad to have you with us.
Good to see you, Ismail.
Thank you very much. Daniel, before we go into the deal itself, can you please explain to us, up until the present time, what has been the situation as far as the legal term is concerned from the Israelis on the status of Masjid Al-Aqsa, or the Al-Haram al-Sharif as it is known?
Well, this problem emerged in the wake of the 1967 war. Under Israel, this is considered to be Israeli territory. It's considered to be part of the occupied Palestinian territories for Palestinians and much of the rest of the world. But from the outset, it was clear that Israel would have to deal with such a sensitive and important site differently. And what emerged in the weeks and months after the war in 1967 is what has come to be known as the status quo. Status quo is very complicated, and there are different interpretations, and those interpretations can lead to tensions and sometimes bloodshed. But at the core of it is something that is not disputed. And what is not disputed is at the core of our discussion. And that is the Haram al-Sharif Al-Aqsa, I'll use both terms for the moment, is exclusively a place of worship For Muslims, it is open for the dignified and respectful visits of non-Muslims in a manner that is coordinated with the Waqf and is compatible with the decorum of the site. A few years back, Netanyahu was cajoled or coerced into saying this officially and in his own voice. Muslims pray on the Temple Mount, non-Muslims visit the Temple Mount.
So let me just re-emphasize that, because there are three very complicated issues that you have handled there. First is, as far as the status quo is concerned, the Al-Haram al-Sharif is only for Muslims to pray in. Any people of other faiths, including the Jewish people, can visit it, provided it's been accepted by the Waqf. And the Waqf are the authorities who are controlling Masjid Al Aqsa, yes?
The Waqf has autonomy, which has been recognized generously in the past, less generously today. It's not without its problems. However, the Waqf does have a good deal of autonomous authority on Haram al-Sharif al-Aqsa, even though it has been eroded somewhat in recent years.
So we go ahead now from 1967. So this has been the position where the Al-Haram al-Sharif is only for Muslims to pray in, and other faith groups can enter it as, if you like, in a dignified manner to see the place, but not to pray within it. So what changes from 1967 to now? What has happened over the years? Actually, if you can tell us, I mean, there has been certain groups in Israel, in particularly I'm thinking of the Temple Mount faithful groups and others allied to them, trying to claim authority over the masjid, or over the Al-Haram al-Sharif.
No, one of the things that is important to bear in mind is that the demand for Jewish prayer on Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount is rather new. Even today, the overwhelming majority of rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, forbid not only Jewish prayer on Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount, Al Aqsa, there should be no access. You're not allowed to go there. Not because the Temple Mount is not sacred. It is sacred. It's too sacred. We're not good enough. We're not worthy enough. But in the wake of the 67 war, and immediately, I'm talking about weeks, there emerged a movement, a Temple Mount movement. Today it is an amalgam of various movements, which sought to establish a Jewish right to prayer. At the time, they were considered to be a fringe. Some would say a lunatic fringe. They went to the Israeli Supreme Court in order to compel the police to allow them to pray on the Mount. And the court recognized the right to pray, but deferred it indefinitely due to reasons of public security and discretion that is vested into Israeli security forces. And that has basically remained the case since then. It's a bit disingenuous. Nobody wants to assume responsibility for forbidding prayer. So you pass on the responsibility to somebody else. Throughout the years, not only has the Temple Mount movement grown, it has gone mainstream. What was once a radical and extreme fringe in Israel is now very much front and center. Today, a vast majority of Netanyahu's ruling party would vote in favor of Jewish prayer on Haram al-Sharif, on the Temple Mount. And there has been a lively discussion not only in Jerusalem, but worldwide. Why shouldn't Jews be allowed to pray on the Mount? What's wrong with that? Don't we have freedom of religion? We're like Rosa Parks, who is told to sit in the back of the bus, and all of a sudden this movement is a human rights movement. One has to add to that developments in recent years, and that is what I call the erosion of the status quo on the Temple Mount. The principle has not changed. Its application has. As the numbers of Temple Mount faithful increase, as the frequency of their visits increase, and also their behavior changes. Today, more often than not, they will walk in as if they're walking into your flat in London, take out tape measure and measure for the drapes and said, soon you're going to be gone and we're going to replace you. And this is what is considered to be the respectful, dignified visits.
So it's very provocative, and also at the same time excluding the Palestinians, in particularly the Muslims, to carry on with their worship in the area.
It is provocative. The police in the past, it's rare for me to give compliments to the Israeli police, but the police commanders on Haram al-Sharif and Temple Mount understood that their career could go up in smoke if there were to be a conflagration on the Mount. And they were usually a very moderating force. That has changed in recent years, and they are now becoming much more permissive. There is prayer on the Mount. There's always a testing of the limits. Now, this is not only a question of the religious, historical, and cultural integrity of the site. I have to emphasize that even for those who are not devout Muslims, Palestinians in East Jerusalem, Haram al-Sharif, the Esplanade, and I'm using Haram al-Sharif and Al-Aqsa interchangeably, we'll distinguish later. It's been one of the few safe places. It's where they can maintain dignity. It is a place of their own. And that has been significantly eroded. And as a result of that, there is a growing fear among Palestinians, which I consider to be not without reason, that the status quo will change.
So let me push you for time. Sorry to interrupt you, Daniel. So far we've established that as far as the bureaucracy or the Israeli law was concerned, the status quo, as we're mentioning it, was that Muslims have a right to pray and access the Al-Haram al-Sharif and the Masjid Al Aqsa, and other faith groups could visit it in a dignified way, which has been eroded. So de facto, because of the Temple Mount movement, the emergence, if should we say, the right wing or within the Israeli society, which is now infringing that anyway. But between the deal we've had on the 13th of August, the so-called Israeli UAE deal, we've had, of course, the Trump plan, which was really scuppered, or it never saw the light of the day. Maybe we need to touch on that before we move on to the main discussion of the night.
Yeah, you're entirely correct. The story of the normalization deal begins with the Trump plan. And there is a long chapter on Jerusalem in the Trump plan, and Jerusalem is designated for exclusive Israeli sovereignty, denationalizes Palestinian East Jerusalem, and marginalizes the Muslim equities in the city. But there is something very stark about this. In one sentence, they say we recommit to maintaining the status quo. And the following sentence is said, the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif, please note the order, Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif, will be open to the peaceful worshipers of all faiths. That's an earthquake, because all of a sudden the official policy of the United States is no status quo. This is a radical change in the status quo.
Big shift.
It didn't receive a lot of attention openly, but behind the scenes it did. And there was so much pushback from within the Arab and Muslim worlds that within 48 hours, U.S. Ambassador David Friedman had a telebriefing or something like that, and he walked it back. He said, we didn't exactly mean it. It requires an agreement, and it won't happen anytime soon. It may not happen at all. But there's a problem with that. What appears in the Trump plan is official U.S. policy, and it is hewn in stone. And what Ambassador Friedman says in a teleconference is written in sand and disappears. But that kind of put things to rest, and one would have hoped, at least, that at least formally, the commitment to maintain the status quo would remain an international consensus. Now, after the fact, we have learned from an Israeli journalist very close to Netanyahu, who's quite an expert on the holy sites in Jerusalem, Nadav Shagai, that the wording of this, allowing for Jewish prayer, was hammered out by a joint Israeli-American team. This was total collusion between Israel and the United States. I can take a guess at who it was probably Ron Dermer and Dory Gold and David Friedman, but regardless. That means that openly Netanyahu is saying, I support the status quo. It's a place of worship for Muslims and a place to visit for non-Muslims. Behind the scenes, he is acting with purpose and close to succeeding, to changing that status quo.
That brings us very nicely, Daniel, to the present situation we have. Now, as I began this show, I mentioned three things that whenever there is an agreement, especially an international agreement, there's three things we need to look for. Actually, what is in the document itself. Second, what is excluded. And third, what those terms mean. And I want to start with the third aspect, really, of what the term means now. A document that has been signed between the Israelis and the UAE in regards to Masjid Al Aqsa, the Haram al Sharif, and how these terminologies have different meanings for the different groups. Daniel, if you'd like to take us on that, please. I think you've muted yourself, Daniel. While Daniel is trying to sort this out, what we're trying to establish is the language that is used. Daniel, okay. You're back on.
I'm back, yes. There was no agreement signed. The agreement is still being worked out between the United States, Israel, and the Emirates. But there was a joint statement. And joint statements like this are kind of ceremonial. They're florid language. They're long on flowery rhetoric and short on detail. Having read the statement at first glance, I didn't see anything problematic with it. Nobody did. But after a couple of days, a colleague of mine and I went through it again, and our jaw dropped. Because in this joint statement, and very out of place, is a specific reference to Al Aqsa and to the holy sites in Jerusalem. Well, one of them is that Muslims from all over the world will now be able to visit and pray in Al Aqsa. Well, there were more than 100,000 Muslim visitors in Jerusalem a year ago, and 50% of them came from countries without diplomatic relations with Israel. So there's not much new there. But the terminology changed. In the Trump plan, they spoke about Haram al-Sharif and the right of everybody to pray there. In the second to last sentence of the joint statement, the following is said. Al-Aqsa Mosque, not Haram al-Sharif, Al-Aqsa Mosque will be a place of worship to Muslims. All other holy sites in Jerusalem will be open to the worship of people of all faiths. Now, I am aware that for the devout Muslim, the entire esplanade mount is Al-Aqsa, but that's not in the Israeli perception. That is not the American perception. That is not what they mean. This is not accidental. This is not a slip of tongue. This is with malice aforethought. And what it means is Jews, the status quo will be maintained because Jews or non-Muslims will not be allowed to pray inside Al-Aqsa Mosque. but everywhere else they'll be able to pray, and everywhere else is those parts of Haram al-Sharif, the esplanade, the Temple Mount, that is not part of the structure. Al-Aqsa is, for the Muslim, a large area, but they use the terminology with precision. They mean the structure of the mosque. This is not an accident.
Let me see if I can come back here. Let me just clarify this. If you can show a map, we have a second map here, which shows this very, very clearly. What we're trying to show, when I showed you this, thank you for this. What we have here is what Daniel is trying to say now, is when the Israelis say Al-Aqsa Mosque, they only refer to the Black Dome Mosque, which Muslims also refer to as Qibli Mosque or Masjid Al-Aqsa. It is in short also referred to Al-Aqsa Masjid. Now, for the bureaucracy, the Israeli bureaucracy, it only means that Black Dome Mosque. It doesn't mean the rest of the Haram al-Sharif, Al-Aqsa Haram al-Sharif. So what the document is stating is that Muslims can pray in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the rest of other faith groups, including Jewish, can pray on the rest of the Al-Haram al-Sharif. So carry on, Daniel, from there.
Yes. Hold on one second. I am.
So the second part of the agreement, Daniel, because we have so far covered the fact that what we have now is a change of language and a situation where before only Muslims could pray in the Haram al-Sharif and other faith groups could visit. What this document, the UAE-Israel Deal, is saying that everybody can pray within the Haram al-Sharif and Muslims can only pray within the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So there's a completely turnaround. And this change in terminology is extremely important because for the Israelis, when they say Al-Haram al-Sharif, they mean the whole area. When they say Al-Aqsa, it only means the red circle, the Black Dome Mosque, and not the whole of the Al-Aqsa, which Muslims now are misinterpreting the two languages. Sorry, carry on, Daniel, on that.
That's entirely correct, but it's not only for the Israelis, it's for the United States. And this means that the official policy now of the United States is that Haram al-Sharif, the esplanade, with the exclusion of the structure of the mosque, should be open to Jewish or non-Muslim prayer. Now, it took me and a friend a few days to figure this out. I have no doubt that the Emiratis were not complicit in this. They were like the Serbian prime minister who found out that his embassy was moving to Jerusalem when Trump announced it and he had to go through. They were duped and they were put in a very difficult position. And I'm saying this regardless of what thinks about normalization.
Yeah, you can be generous to the Emiratis, Daniel. I have no problems with that. But what we have here as an impact on the deal itself, whether they did it maliciously or whether they did it without reading the text, which is quite possible because they were told to sign, so they signed on the dotted line. What the impact now is that we have now a change of the legal understanding as far as the Israeli authorities are concerned. And this is a potential move for them now to have greater access to Al-Haram al-Sharif. And do you see potential parallels here with the mosque in Al-Khalil in Hebron, the site of and potential division?
100%. The dream of the Temple Mount movement, and I'm talking about the moderate ones, is the nightmare of Palestinians and Muslims. And that is what is called a temporal division of the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif. You do not divide it physically, you divide it time-wise, so that there will be hours of the day in which it will be a Jewish site. There will be hours of the day it will be a Muslim site. This is the model of the Ibrahimiyya Mosque, the Tomb of the Patriarchs, which I have to say, Hebron is probably the most toxic place in Israel-Palestine. It is where occupation is at its worst. And the most toxic place in the toxic place is that mosque. It is simply a grotesque representation of sanctity. And we are already seeing this happen. In the past, for example, the Israeli police would deny the Temple Mount movement access to Haram al-Sharif in the particularly sacred days, final days of Ramadan. No more. Basically, we are imposing our presence. Many in the Temple Mount declare their intention. And what this means is the transformation of Al Aqsa, Haram al-Sharif, and Temple Mount. For me, it's Temple Mount. I believe our temple was there. I just don't think it should be weaponized against Muslims, and it doesn't give me any specific rights of prayer today. But what we're seeing before our eyes is the transformation of a Muslim site with the historical, religious, and cultural integrity of 1,300 years of Islamic history being transformed into a shared Jewish-Muslim site. That is the dream of the Temple Mount movement. It is the nightmare of Muslims and Palestinians, and we are far closer to that today than we were 2 weeks ago.
You obviously paint a very, very bleak picture for us. In fact, I think most of the Muslim world as well have been negligent of what the deal, the UAE-Israel deal means for Masjid Al Aqsa. And I think a lot of people will be alarmed. But the issue is, of course, if it comes, once the Jewish authority, the Jewish Temple Mount movement and the Israeli government takes a move, I think the impact could be reverberating throughout the Middle East, and we could actually have a crisis on our hand. And do you foresee this kind of scenarios emerging, Daniel?
Not in the immediate future. Please note that Netanyahu has been shouting his real and imaginary achievements from the rooftops. But he didn't say a word about the change in the status quo after the Trump plan. He and the Temple Mount movement know that this has to be done cautiously, perhaps with stealth. This is clearly a landmine that Ambassador Friedman is leaving for the next administration. This will be incremental. But one of the things that I am conveying to my friends in the Arab world, this has a lot to do with you. This is you have equities here, and you ignore what is happening here at your peril. Because if there will be a conflagration, and I believe that a conflagration is quite possible, this will come out. I have to emphasize, it is not too late to stop this. This can be walked back very easily. And we've been advising friends in the international community how this can be done in a very non-utopian world. I'm not fantasizing. We can make this go away. But in order to make this go away, we need a robust and articulate engagement from the international community in general, but also particularly from our friends in the Arab world.
Daniel, thank you very much for a very, very informative talk. I'm afraid, the half an hour has really flown back. I'm sure we could have more time to carry on. Now, so thank you very much, Daniel, for your insight and your briefing on the site of Masjid Al Aqsa. Just as a summary, really, what we've discussed today, really, is that UAE-Israel deal really undermines the legitimacy of Muslims to Masjid Al Aqsa. Second, it is a potential of dividing the Haram al-Sharif and losing control over it by the Muslims. So therefore, the Muslims really need to wake up and need to become proactive. One of the things you can do is, of course, join Friends of Al Aqsa and visit our website follow the hashtag Hands Off Al Aqsa to see, as what Daniel has mentioned, how we can try and put pressure so that this does not escalate into the division between the people and maybe even trickle down into a crisis point within the region. Perhaps one of the things that end in a somber note, or perhaps something we should wake up with, is the flight itself. And Daniel, you might want to say one or two words afterward at the end. The flight that was taken, the El Al flight 971 from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, had a big emblem and flag saying peace. But just underneath that, somebody has noticed that the plane's real name was Kiryat Gat. And Benny Morris has mentioned that Kiryat Gat was a Palestinian village in 1948, known by the name of Al-Fallujah, which was ethnically cleansed. So peace came at the cost of rubbing off Palestinians and dispossessing them from their own territory. We hope that this peace deal between UAE and Israel does not wipe out Masjid Al Aqsa and Al Haram Al Sharif. And I believe it is to all people of all faith groups, to ensure that we carry on and try and make sure that people of all faiths can live happily and peacefully in Jerusalem, but in particularly for Muslims as well, to rise up to this occasion and make sure that this does not slide down into a crisis for them. Daniel, thank you very much. And thank you very much for all our listeners for joining us. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.